The scream still hung in the air of the great hall when Elena Voss felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Every eye in the room was on her. Hundreds of pack members, dressed in their finest clothes for a night that was supposed to be a celebration, stood frozen around the long stone hall. Torches burned along the walls, throwing orange light across faces that had gone pale with shock. At the center of it all stood Draven Ashworth, the Alpha King, tall and commanding, his jaw tight, his eyes as cold as the stone beneath their feet. He had just called her nothing. Not his mate, not his equal, nothing. The words replayed in Elena's mind, sharp as a blade, in front of the visiting leaders from 3 rival packs, in front of his own council, in front of everyone who mattered. Draven had denied her. He had looked directly at her and said the words that would end everything between them. She is not my mate. She is simply a guest in my house. The visiting Alpha, a broad man named Victor Lang, had raised an eyebrow at that, clearly satisfied. His pack had come seeking an alliance, one that required Draven to marry Victor's daughter for political gain. Elena, a rogue with no family name and no lineage to offer the kingdom, had always been seen as an obstacle to that plan. Tonight, Draven had removed the obstacle in the easiest way possible. He had simply erased her. Elena's hands trembled at her sides. She could feel her wolf, Sable, pacing inside her chest, a slow and heavy movement that felt nothing like panic. It felt like grief. She did not cry in front of them. She would not give them that. Instead, she turned, lifted her chin, and walked out of the hall with steps that did not shake, even though everything inside her was breaking apart. Behind her, she heard nothing, no footsteps following her, no voice calling her name, only silence, and the low murmur of the crowd beginning to whisper the moment she was out of earshot. She made it to the hallway before the first tear fell, then the second. By the time she reached the staircase leading to the guest wing, she was crying freely, her breath coming in short, painful bursts. She pressed her palm against the cold stone wall and forced herself to keep moving. She would not collapse here, where any servant or council member might see her. Sable stayed quiet within her, a strange and heavy stillness that Elena did not have the strength to question yet. She only knew that something inside her chest had changed, like a rope pulled taut for so long that it had finally begun to fray. Above the hall, on a private balcony that overlooked the courtyard, Draven stood with his hands braced against the stone railing. He had not moved since Elena left the room. The council had resumed their conversation with Victor Lang, congratulating him on the future alliance, but Draven heard none of it. His eyes were fixed on the doorway through which Elena had disappeared. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself that a king could not afford sentiment when the safety of 3,000 pack members depended on securing peace with Victor Lang's territory. He told himself that Elena would understand, in time, that this was simply what leadership required. But something in his chest refused to settle. Deep inside him, his wolf, Kaine, had gone utterly still. Not asleep, not calm, still in the way a storm goes still, right before it breaks. Draven ignored it. He always ignored Kaine when the wolf disagreed with his decisions. It was easier that way. A king who let his wolf's instincts override strategy was a king who would not last long on this throne, especially not with enemies circling the borders and old alliances turning fragile with every passing season. He told himself this again as he walked back into the hall, accepted congratulations he did not want, and smiled at people he did not care about. It was hours later, long after the guests had retired to their chambers and the hall had emptied, that Draven finally allowed himself to walk toward the west wing, where Elena's room was. He told himself he only wanted to check on her, nothing more. A king's obligation, perhaps, to make sure the woman he had humiliated in front of an entire kingdom was not doing something reckless in her grief. When he reached her door, it was already open. Not open like an invitation, open like an exit. The room was empty, not just of Elena, but of everything that belonged to her. Her clothes were gone from the wardrobe, the small collection of books she kept on the windowsill, gone. The single photograph she had of her mother, the only family she had ever spoken of, no longer sat on the nightstand. Draven stood in the doorway for a long moment, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were telling him. She was gone. Not sulking in her room. Not waiting for an apology. Gone. He moved through the room quickly, as if searching might change what was clearly true. He checked the small bathroom, the closet, even beneath the bed, though some distant part of him knew this was foolish. Elena was not the kind of woman who hid. She was the kind of woman who left. He found her on the outer edge of the palace grounds, near the gates that separated the royal territory from the open road beyond. She had a single bag over her shoulder, her hair pulled back, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. The guards at the gate had clearly been too stunned by her sudden appearance to stop her, unsure whether the king's supposed guest had any obligation to remain within the walls. Draven stopped several paces away, his boots silent on the gravel path. Elena. She did not turn around immediately. When she finally did, her eyes were dry. Whatever tears she had shed earlier were gone now, replaced by something far more unsettling. Calm. A terrible, quiet calm that made Draven's chest tighten in a way he did not understand. "You made your position very clear tonight," she said. Her voice did not shake. "I understood it completely." "That was politics," Draven said, taking a step closer. "You know how these alliances work." "It meant nothing." "It meant everything," Elena replied. "You didn't hesitate, not even for a second. You looked right at me and you called me nothing, in front of everyone who has ever looked at me twice and wondered why a king would choose someone like me." "I need this alliance," Draven said, his voice rising slightly with frustration, though he could not have said whether the frustration was directed at her or at himself. "Victor Lang's territory borders the northern packs that have been raiding our lands for 2 years. Without this agreement, we lose the north entirely." "Then have it," Elena said simply. "Marry his daughter if that's what your kingdom needs. I won't stand in the way of your throne." The words landed like a physical blow. Draven opened his mouth to respond, to explain, to somehow make her understand that this was not what he wanted, only what circumstances demanded of him, but nothing came out. He had spent so many years learning to speak like a king, weighing every word for its political value, that in this single moment, when honesty was the only thing that mattered, he found he had nothing true left to say. Elena watched him struggle, and something in her expression softened, just slightly, before hardening again. "I loved you," she said. "I want you to know that, before I go. Whatever this was between us, on my side, it was real. I don't know if it ever was on yours." "It was," Draven said, finally finding his voice. "Elena, it was real. I never lied about that." "Then why?" she asked, her voice breaking for the first time. "Did it take you less than one sentence to give me away?" He had no answer. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unbearable, until Elena finally turned and walked through the gates without waiting for him to find the words he could not produce. Draven did not follow her. He stood at the gate, watching her figure grow smaller against the dark line of the tree road that led away from the palace, telling himself that this was for the best, that a king needed to prioritize his kingdom over his own heart, that she would find somewhere safe, and eventually, this pain would fade for both of them. He almost believed it. Then, deep within his chest, Kane finally spoke, his voice a low and mournful growl that Draven felt in his bones rather than heard with his ears. "He lost us forever." Draven froze. The words did not feel like a passing thought or an exaggerated reaction to a difficult night. They felt like a verdict, a door closing somewhere deep inside him, somewhere he had never fully understood, but had always trusted to remain open. "She'll come back," Draven said aloud, though there was no one to hear him except the guard standing several paces away, wisely pretending not to listen. "She has nowhere else to go." Kane did not answer again. The wolf had retreated into a silence that felt entirely different from his usual quiet moods. This silence had weight to it, finality. Draven turned and walked back toward the palace, refusing to look back at the road one more time, refusing to acknowledge the cold feeling spreading through his chest like ice water. He told himself it was simply exhaustion from the long night, from the political maneuvering, from the pressure of holding a kingdom together, with alliances that always seemed to demand another piece of himself. He did not yet understand what Kane already knew. Somewhere beyond the gates, walking alone into the darkness with nothing but a single bag and a broken heart, Elena felt something shift within her chest as well. Sable, who had been silent and heavy since the moment Draven spoke those words in the hall, finally stirred. Elena expected sadness. She expected the wolf to whimper, to beg her to turn back, to plead for the mate bond they had shared since the night they first recognized Draven and Cain as their true match. That was what wolves did, wasn't it? They clung to their mates, even through pain, even through betrayal. But Sable did not beg. Instead, the wolf's presence within her steadied, growing calm in a way that felt almost like relief. Elena did not understand it fully yet, but she felt it clearly. Something had ended tonight. Not just a relationship, not just an engagement that had never been formally announced, but something deeper. Something that had connected her to Draven since the very beginning. She kept walking, her bag heavy on her shoulder, her heart heavier still, unaware that behind her, in the palace she had just left, the king who let her go was only beginning to understand the cost of his choice. The road stretched long and dark ahead of her, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena felt like she was walking toward something, rather than away from everything she had ever wanted. She did not know yet where that road would lead. She only knew she could not go back. Behind her, the palace lights faded into the distance, and with them, faded a bond that Draven Ashworth would spend the rest of his life trying, and failing, to understand, until it was almost too late. Morning found Elena on the outskirts of a small trading town 2 days from the palace, her feet blistered, her body exhausted from walking through the night rather than risk being followed. She had taken shelter briefly in an abandoned barn just after dawn, sleeping only a few hours before pressing on, driven by an instinct she did not fully understand. She did not look back toward the palace, not once. Every part of her, human and wolf alike, understood that looking back would only make the walking harder. As the sun rose fully over the trees, casting long golden light across the dirt road, Elena allowed herself a single moment to stop and breathe. She closed her eyes and reached inward, searching for the familiar hum of the mate bond that had lived inside her chest for the past 2 years, ever since the night she and Draven had first met beneath a different sky entirely. It was still there, faint and thin, like a single thread stretched almost to breaking. But it no longer pulled at her the way it once had. It no longer ached with the need to return to him. Sable's voice rose softly within her mind, gentle but certain. "We are not broken. We are simply free." Elena opened her eyes and looked down the long road ahead of her, toward a future she could not yet see clearly, but one that no longer depended on a king who had chosen his crown over her heart. She took a breath, adjusted the bag on her shoulder, and began walking again. Whatever waited for her out there, she would face it as herself, not as anyone's forgotten guest. 3 days after Elena disappeared through the palace gates, Draven Ashworth sat at the head of the council table and realized he had not heard a single word spoken in the last 10 minutes. Rowan Blackwood, his chief advisor, was mid-sentence about grain shipments from the eastern farms when he noticed the king's attention had drifted somewhere far beyond the room. Rowan cleared his throat, and Draven blinked, straightening in his chair as though nothing had happened. "Continue," Draven said, his voice sharper than he intended. Rowan exchanged a glance with the other council members before resuming his report, though the tension in the room had thickened noticeably. It was not the first time this week the king had lost focus during a meeting that mattered. It would not be the last. Draven told himself it was simply the weight of the alliance negotiations. Victor Lang had returned to his own territory satisfied, believing the marriage arrangement with his daughter was all but settled. There were papers to draft, borders to discuss, terms to finalize. A king had every reason to be distracted by matters of state. He did not let himself think about the other reason. Not during council meetings, not during meals he barely touched, not during the long hours before sleep when the palace grew quiet and his mind, without the distraction of duty, wandered inevitably toward the gates and the road beyond them. Kaine had not spoken since that night. At first, Draven assumed it was simply his wolf sulking, the way Cain sometimes did when Draven made decisions the wolf disagreed with. It had happened before, though never for this long. Usually within a day or two, Kaine would return to his usual restless energy, eager to run, eager to hunt, eager to remind Draven that being an alpha meant more than sitting behind a desk signing treaties. But 3 days had passed, and the silence inside him had not broken. It felt less like sulking and more like absence, as though something that had always lived inside his chest had simply packed its bags and left, the same way Elena had. He shook off the thought and forced himself to focus on the council meeting, though his mind kept circling back to the same unanswered question. Where had she gone? Did she have enough money for lodging? Did she have anyone to turn to? Elena had come to the pack as a rogue, without family, without connections, without a home to return to if this one failed her. He told himself this was simply concern for a former guest, nothing more. He told himself a great many things that week, most of which he did not believe even as he thought them. That evening, after the council had dispersed, and the palace had settled into its nighttime quiet, Draven found himself standing once again outside Elena's empty room. He had not been back since the night she left, and he was not entirely sure why he had come now, except that the silence of the palace felt unbearable, and some part of him hoped that returning to the place where she had once lived might quiet the strange hollow feeling spreading through his chest. The room had been cleaned, fresh linens on the bed, the wardrobe empty, and waiting for whichever future guest might occupy it next. There was nothing left of her here, nothing except the faint impression of her presence that Draven could not quite shake, no matter how hard he tried. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, and finally allowed himself to say aloud what he had refused to voice all week. I made a mistake. The words felt strange leaving his mouth. Kings did not often admit to mistakes, especially not to empty rooms where no one could hear them. But something about speaking it aloud made the truth undeniable, in a way that simply thinking it had not. Kane stirred, faintly, for the first time in days, not a full return, but a flicker, like a candle catching, before threatening to go out again. I know, Draven said quietly, as though the wolf could hear him more clearly through spoken words. I know it was wrong. I thought I didn't have a choice. There is always a choice, Kane finally answered, his voice weaker than usual, distant, in a way that frightened Draven more than he wanted to admit. You made yours, she made hers. What does that mean? Draven asked, though he was not sure he wanted the answer. Kane did not respond again that night. Over the following days, Draven threw himself into his duties with an intensity that even his most demanding advisors found excessive. He reviewed border reports late into the night. He personally inspected the northern patrol routes that Victor Lang's alliance was meant to secure. He signed treaties, approved trade agreements, and settled disputes between pack members with a swiftness that left the entire court unsettled. It was, Rowan Blackwood observed quietly to another council member, as though the king was trying to outrun something he could not name. Draven heard the whispered comment as he passed through the hallway one evening, though he pretended he had not. He was not running from anything, he told himself. He was simply fulfilling his responsibilities as king, the same responsibilities that had always come first, long before Elena had ever arrived at the palace gates 2 years earlier. But even as he told himself this, a quieter, more honest part of him understood that Rowan was right. He was running. He simply had no idea what direction would lead him away from the growing weight in his chest, because the one thing that might have eased it was the very thing he had thrown away with a single careless sentence in front of an entire hall of witnesses. Word of Elena's departure spread quickly through the pack, as such things always did. Some members whispered that she had simply grown tired of court life and returned to whatever rogue territory she had come from. Others speculated, more accurately, that the king's public rejection had driven her away, and that speculation came with an undercurrent of disapproval that Draven felt every time he walked through the palace corridors and noticed conversations falling suddenly silent. He had been well respected before that night, fair, if occasionally distant, strong, if sometimes cold, but the story of how he had denied his own mate in front of a rival alpha for the sake of political gain had already begun to take root among his people, and Draven could feel the shift in how they looked at him now, though no one dared say anything directly to his face. A king's reputation was not built on power alone. It was built on trust, on the belief that he would protect his own, that his word meant something. Draven had spent years cultivating that trust among his pack, and in one night, in one sentence, He had cracked something in that foundation that he was only beginning to understand could not simply be repaired through decisive leadership alone. 2 weeks after Elena's departure, Victor Lang sent a formal message proposing a date for the wedding between Draven and his daughter, along with detailed terms for the alliance that would follow. Draven read the letter 3 times at his desk, the parchment growing damp beneath his fingers, before finally setting it aside without responding. He told himself he needed time to consider the terms carefully. In truth, he could not bring himself to write the acceptance that would have been the easiest, most politically sound decision of his reign. That night, for the first time since Elena left, Cain spoke to him clearly again, his voice carrying a weight that settled deep into Draven's bones. "You cannot marry her," Cain said, "not while a piece of us still belongs somewhere else." "The bond will fade," Draven said, though even as he spoke the words, he did not believe them. "It has to. It's been weeks." "Some bonds do not fade," Cain answered. "Some bonds simply wait, until they cannot wait any longer, and then they close, and when they close, nothing on this earth reopens them." Draven sat in silence for a long time after that, staring out his window toward the dark road that led away from the palace, wondering, for the first time with real fear rather than simple regret, whether he had already run out of time to fix what he had broken. Far beyond the palace walls, in a small trading town 2 days south, Elena Voss stood in the doorway of a modest inn, counting the coins remaining in her small purse, and calculating how many more nights she could afford before she needed to find work. She had left with little, but she had left with purpose, and each morning that passed without the pull of the mate bond dragging her thoughts back toward the palace felt like another small victory. Sable remained quiet within her, steady and calm, no longer the anxious, straining presence she had been for months before that final night in the hall. Elena did not yet fully understand what that calm meant. She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was making decisions based entirely on what she wanted, rather than what would keep the peace, what would please the court, what would make her worthy of a king who had never quite managed to choose her when it mattered most. She tucked her coins away, squared her shoulders, and stepped out into the busy street to look for work. Whatever waited for her next, she intended to build it herself. 2 years earlier, on a night when the moon hung full and bright above a forest far from any palace walls, Draven Ashworth had not yet been crowned king. He was still the heir, the eldest son of an aging alpha, carrying the weight of a title he had not yet grown fully into, running through the trees with a small group of pack warriors on a routine patrol along the southern border. It was Kaine who noticed her first, a sudden sharpness in his senses that made Draven stop mid-stride, his warriors nearly colliding into him from behind. "There," Kaine had said, his voice more alert than Draven had ever heard it. "Something waits there." They found her in a small clearing, crouched low and wary, a young woman with torn clothes and eyes that carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had been running for a very long time. She held a hunting knife in one hand, ready to defend herself, though her stance told Draven she had not eaten properly in days. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, before he could speak. "I'll be gone by morning." Draven had opened his mouth to respond with the usual caution his warriors expected from him, toward unknown rogues wandering into pack territory. Instead, what came out was something entirely different. "You don't have to run anymore." He had not planned to say it. The words simply arrived, pulled from somewhere deep and instinctive, the same place where Kaine's sudden and overwhelming reaction had originated the moment their eyes met hers. "Mate," Kaine had said, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, "she is ours." Elena Voss had been running from a pack that no longer existed, a small territory to the west that had been overtaken by a rival alpha 2 years before, its members scattered or worse. She had spent those years alone, surviving on instinct and whatever work she could find in towns too small to ask questions about a lone rogue woman passing through. She did not trust Draven's warriors at first, and she certainly did not trust the sudden warmth in the eyes of the pack heir who had found her in that clearing. But something about the way he looked at her, as though she was not a stray to be tolerated, but something precious to be protected, slowly wore down the walls she had built around herself over those difficult years. It took months before Elena fully believed that the bond between them was real. that Draven was not simply another temporary shelter she would eventually have to leave behind. It took even longer before she allowed herself to hope that a future king might actually choose a rogue with no name, no lineage, and no political value to offer his throne. For a while, it seemed as though he would. Draven's father, the old Alpha, had been surprisingly accepting of the match, more concerned with his son's happiness in his final years than with the political calculations that would later come to dominate the court under Draven's rule. He had welcomed Elena into the pack with genuine warmth, and for nearly a year, Elena had allowed herself to believe that she had finally found the home she had been searching for since the destruction of her original pack. Everything changed when the old Alpha passed, and Draven ascended to the throne. The crown brought with it responsibilities that Draven had never fully anticipated, chief among them, the political reality that a king's choices were rarely his own. Where his father had ruled with a degree of independence, built over decades of established respect, Draven inherited a throne, surrounded by advisors eager to shape a young king's decisions, and among the loudest of those voices was Rowan Blackwood. Rowan had served the pack for over 20 years, first as a trusted advisor to Draven's father, and now as the primary architect of Draven's foreign policy. He was not a cruel man, not exactly, but he was a pragmatic one, and pragmatism, Elena would come to learn, rarely left room for sentiment. A king without political alliances is a king who will not survive his first true crisis, Rowan told Draven often, during long council sessions that Elena was rarely invited to attend. Your father was fortunate to rule during years of relative peace. You will not have that same fortune, not with the northern packs growing bolder every season. Rowan's solution, proposed gently at first and more insistently as the months passed, was a marriage alliance. Victor Lang's territory sat directly between Draven's lands and the northern packs responsible for a growing number of border raids. A marriage between Draven and Victor's daughter would secure that border permanently, granting access to Victor's warriors and resources in exchange for a title that would elevate his family's standing considerably. Draven resisted the idea for a long time, insisting that his bond with Elena was not something he was willing to sacrifice for political convenience. But the raids continued. Villages along the northern border reported losses. Council meetings grew tense with reports of casualties among the patrol warriors, and slowly, gradually, the pragmatic voices in Draven's court began to drown out his own conviction. Elena noticed the shift long before Draven was willing to admit it existed. She noticed how he grew quieter after council meetings, how he stopped mentioning their future together with the same certainty he once had, how his advisors began finding small ways to exclude her from important gatherings, citing her lack of formal standing within the pack's political structure. She raised her concerns to him gently at first, then with growing urgency, as the pattern became impossible to ignore. "They're pushing you toward something," she told him one evening, nearly a year before the night in the Great Hall, that would end everything between them. "I can see it happening, even if you can't." "They're advising me," Draven had replied, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "That's their job. It doesn't mean I'll follow every piece of advice they offer." But he did follow it, slowly and in small ways at first, agreeing to formal meetings with Victor Lang's representatives, allowing discussions of alliance terms to continue, even as he insisted privately to Elena that nothing would come of them. Each small concession felt insignificant on its own, a reasonable diplomatic gesture, rather than a genuine threat to their bond. But together, over the course of that year, those small concessions built towards something neither of them fully recognized until it was almost too late. Sable had warned Elena long before Elena was willing to accept the warning herself. "He is choosing pieces of his crown over pieces of us," the wolf had said one night, months before the final humiliation in the Great Hall. "Every time he lets them speak for him instead of speaking for himself, he gives away something we cannot easily get back." Elena had wanted to believe otherwise. She had wanted to believe that Draven's love for her was strong enough to withstand any political pressure, that the bond they shared, the rare and powerful connection between Sable and Cain that had formed the very night they met, was something no advisor or rival Alpha could ever truly threaten. She had been wrong, and by the time she understood exactly how wrong, the damage had already spread too deep to easily repair. Looking back on those months from the small trading town where she now found herself building a new life, Elena could see the pattern clearly for the first time, the slow accumulation of small betrayals that had finally culminated in the single devastating sentence Draven spoke in front of Victor Lang. It had not been one mistake. It had been 100 small mistakes, each one chipping away at the foundation of trust between them, until nothing remained strong enough to hold when the true test finally arrived. She understood now why Sable had reacted the way she had that final night, why the wolf had chosen calm acceptance rather than desperate grief. Sable had been watching this pattern unfold for far longer than Elena had allowed herself to see it, and by the time Draven finally spoke those words in the Great Hall, the wolf had already made peace with what needed to happen next. Elena wiped down the counter of the small tavern where she had found temporary work, her mind still tangled in memories of a life she had left behind, when the tavern owner, a kind older woman named Margaret Fenwick, approached her with an unexpected offer. "You've got steady hands and a sharper mind than most who wander through here," Margaret said, studying Elena with the careful assessment of someone who had spent decades learning to read people quickly. "There's a small pack settling into the hills west of here, independent, not tied to any of the larger territories causing all this trouble along the borders. They're looking for members with useful skills. I could put in a word, if you're interested in something more permanent than pouring drinks for travelers." Elena hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I would appreciate that," she said, and for the first time since walking through the palace gates weeks earlier, she felt something that resembled genuine hope taking root inside her chest. Whatever waited for her in those western hills, she intended to meet it as someone rebuilding her life on her own terms, free from a bond that had cost her more than she had ever been willing to admit until the very night it finally broke. The first true crack in Draven and Elena's bond had appeared nearly 8 months before that final night in the Great Hall, though neither of them recognized it as a crack at the time. It felt, instead, like an isolated incident, an unfortunate misunderstanding that would surely be resolved once tempers cooled. It began with a warning Elena tried to give him about one of his own council members, a warning Draven dismissed too quickly, too easily, in front of the very man Elena had tried to caution him against. His name was Nathaniel Cross, a mid-ranking advisor who had been quietly building influence within the court for years, positioning himself as a trusted voice on matters of trade and border security. Elena had noticed things about him that unsettled her, small inconsistencies in the reports he presented, private conversations he seemed to have with representatives from rival territories that he never mentioned to the rest of the council. She raised her concerns to Draven privately, expecting him to at least investigate the matter quietly. Instead, during the very next council session, Draven mentioned Elena's suspicions aloud, framing them almost as a curiosity rather than a genuine warning, watching Nathaniel's reaction with what he believed was careful political observation. Nathaniel had laughed it off smoothly, suggesting that perhaps the rogue woman simply misunderstood the complexities of trade negotiations, and the council had chuckled along with him, the matter dismissed within minutes. Elena had been humiliated, not just by Nathaniel's dismissal, but by Draven's willingness to expose her concerns so carelessly, without warning her beforehand, without considering how it would look to reveal her suspicions in a room full of people already skeptical of her place in the court. "You made me look foolish," she told him that night, her voice tight with a frustration she rarely allowed herself to show. "Whether or not Nathaniel is hiding something, you didn't even give me the chance to explain myself properly. You just handed my concerns over, like they were nothing worth protecting." "I thought transparency would help," Draven had said, genuinely confused by her anger. "If I investigated quietly, it would look like I was accusing him without cause. Bringing it into the open seemed like the fairer approach." "Fair to him, maybe," Elena had replied, "not fair to me." It was a small argument in the scope of everything that would follow, resolved within a few days through careful conversation and Draven's genuine, if somewhat clumsy apology. But something had shifted after that night, a small crack that neither of them fully addressed, allowing it to remain, rather than working together to seal it properly. 6 months later, Nathaniel Cross was discovered to have been quietly feeding information to a rival territory in exchange for personal financial gain, exactly as Elena had suspected. Draven removed him from the council swiftly, and privately acknowledged to Elena that her instincts had been correct from the beginning. But the acknowledgement came too late to undo the earlier damage. Sable had already begun to notice a pattern that troubled her deeply, one that Elena tried to dismiss as an isolated incident, but that the wolf recognized as something far more concerning. "He listens to his counsel before he listens to us," Sable observed one evening, not with anger but with quiet, careful attention. "Even when we are right, he needs proof before he will trust us the way he trusts them." Elena had wanted to argue against this observation, but she found she could not entirely disagree. It was a small thing, perhaps, but small things, left unaddressed, had a way of growing. The pattern repeated itself in different forms over the following months. A dispute over Elena's formal title within the court, which Draven promised to resolve but continually postponed due to more pressing political matters. A social gathering where Elena was seated at a table far from Draven's side, positioned instead among lower-ranking court members. A seating arrangement Draven claimed was simply an oversight by his staff but never personally corrected. A tense conversation about the growing likelihood of an alliance marriage, which Draven insisted would never happen, while simultaneously allowing preliminary discussions with Victor Lang's representatives to continue. Each incident, taken individually, seemed manageable, forgivable, the kind of friction any relationship might experience under the pressure of a demanding position. But Sable's warnings grew more insistent with each passing month, and Elena found herself increasingly unable to ignore what her wolf had been trying to tell her for some time. "We are giving pieces of ourselves to hold this bond together," Sable said one night, several weeks before the final humiliation in the Great Hall, "but he is not giving pieces of himself in return. A bond cannot survive on one side alone, no matter how strong that side chooses to be." Elena had cried that night, quietly, alone in her room, torn between her deep love for Draven and her growing understanding that something essential was missing from what they shared. She loved him. She did not doubt that, not for a single moment throughout everything that followed. But loving someone, and being truly valued by them, she was beginning to understand, were not always the same thing. She confronted Draven about it directly only once, roughly a month before the night everything finally broke. She sat him down in his private study, away from advisors and court members, and told him plainly that she felt herself becoming invisible within the very life they had built together. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she told him, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of the confession. "Piece by piece, every time you let someone else's opinion matter more than mine, every time you postpone giving me the standing I deserve, every time you let the court treat me like I'm temporary. I need to know if that's what I actually am to you. Temporary." Draven had reached for her hands across the desk, his expression pained in a way that seemed genuine, and told her, with what she believed at the time was complete sincerity, that she was not temporary, that she was the most important person in his life, that he was simply trying to navigate an impossibly difficult political situation while protecting what mattered most to him. She had wanted to believe him. She had believed him, for a while. But belief, Sable reminded her gently in the weeks that followed, was not the same as evidence, and evidence, so far, had consistently pointed in a different direction than his words. The final month before the Great Hall humiliation passed in a haze of growing tension, Victor Lang's visit was announced. Preliminary alliance terms were drafted. Draven grew increasingly distant, consumed by preparations for the negotiations, offering Elena reassurances that grew shorter and less convincing with each passing week. Sable stopped offering warnings in those final weeks. Instead, the wolf simply grew quiet, conserving her energy, watching, waiting, as though she already sensed what was coming and had begun preparing herself for whatever decision she would ultimately need to make. Elena did not fully understand her wolf's silence at the time. She would only understand it fully in the days following the Great Hall, when Sable's calm, resolute acceptance of the bond's severance revealed exactly how long the wolf had been quietly preparing for an ending that Elena herself had refused to see coming until it was standing directly in front of her. Looking back from her new position in the Western Hills, working alongside a small independent pack that Margaret Fenwick's recommendation had helped her join, Elena finally understood the full scope of what had happened between her and Draven. It had never been a single betrayal. It had been an accumulation, a slow erosion built from 100 small moments, where he had chosen the easier path over the harder truth. Until finally, on the night it mattered most, there was nothing left of the bond strong enough to withstand one final, devastating choice. She did not regret loving him. She simply regretted, quietly and privately, that she had spent so long convincing herself the cracks were nothing to worry about, when Sable had been trying to warn her the entire time. The morning of Victor Lang's arrival, Draven woke before dawn with a tightness in his chest that he mistook for simple pre-negotiation nerves. He dressed carefully, reviewing the day's schedule with Rowan Blackwood over a hurried breakfast, running through the careful language they had prepared for discussing the alliance terms, without making any binding commitments too early in the negotiations. "Remember," Rowan said, folding a napkin with precise, deliberate movements, "Victor Lang responds to strength and certainty. Any hesitation on your part, any indication that your priorities lie elsewhere, and he will use it as leverage to demand more favorable terms. We cannot afford that, not with the northern raids escalating the way they have this season." Draven nodded, though something in Rowan's words settled uneasily in his stomach. He understood the logic. He had understood it for months now, through countless council meetings and careful strategic planning sessions, but understanding the logic and feeling comfortable with its consequences were two very different things. Elena had not been informed of the specific details of that day's negotiations. It had become something of an unspoken pattern over the previous months. Draven realized with a flicker of guilt he quickly suppressed, that important political matters simply were not shared with her the way they once had been. He told himself it was to protect her from unnecessary stress, from the pressure of court politics she had never asked to be part of. He did not examine too closely whether that reasoning was entirely honest. Victor Lang arrived at midday with an entourage of nearly 30 warriors and advisors, along with his daughter, a composed young woman named Isabel Frost, who greeted Draven with the polite, practiced warmth of someone well-trained in diplomatic courtesy. Draven greeted her in kind, aware of Rowan watching the exchange carefully from a few paces away, aware too of the weight of expectation pressing down on every word he spoke. The afternoon passed in a series of formal meetings, discussions of border security, trade routes, and the specific terms under which Victor Lang's warriors might assist in repelling the northern raids that had plagued Draven's territory for 2 years. The negotiations were going well, better than Draven had anticipated, and by the time evening approached and the great hall began filling with pack members preparing for the formal welcoming feast, Draven allowed himself a rare moment of genuine relief. That relief evaporated the instant Victor Lang, standing near the head table with a goblet of wine in hand, turned the conversation toward more personal matters in front of a gathering crowd of both packs. "I understand there is a woman in your court," Victor said, his tone carrying the deceptively casual weight of a man who had already calculated exactly how this conversation would unfold. "A rogue, I've heard. No family name to speak of. Some in my own court have expressed concern about the nature of her position here, given the alliance we're discussing." The hall had grown quieter around them, conversations trailing off as more attention turned toward the exchange. Draven felt his pulse quicken, aware suddenly that this was not a private negotiation happening behind closed doors, but a public test, staged deliberately in front of witnesses who would carry word of his response back to every corner of both territories. "Elena has been part of my court for 2 years," Draven said carefully, choosing his words with the caution of a man walking across thin ice. "She has earned her place here." "Earned it how, precisely?" Victor pressed, his eyes sharp despite his casual tone. "Forgive my bluntness, but my daughter deserves clarity before any formal agreement moves forward. If there is an existing attachment that might complicate this alliance, it would be far better to address it now, plainly, rather than allow it to fester into a diplomatic embarrassment later." Draven felt the weight of the entire hall pressing down on him, felt Rowan's warning gaze fixed on him from across the room, felt the careful months of political preparation converging into this single unbearable moment. He thought, in that instant, of the northern villages that had suffered losses in the raids. He thought of the warriors who had died defending borders that Victor Lang's resources could help protect. He thought of everything Rowan had told him about the necessity of appearing decisive, uncomplicated, entirely committed to the alliance in front of him. He did not think, in that moment, clearly enough about Elena, standing near the edge of the hall, close enough to hear every word. "She is not my mate," Draven said, the words leaving his mouth before he had fully processed their weight. "She is simply a guest in my house." The silence that followed felt endless. Victor Lang's expression shifted into something satisfied, the tension in his shoulders easing visibly now that the potential obstacle had been so cleanly removed. Isabel Frost offered a small, polite smile, clearly relieved that whatever awkwardness might have complicated her own position had been resolved so efficiently. Draven did not look toward Elena immediately. He could not bring himself to. But he felt the shift in the room the moment she turned and walked out, felt the weight of hundreds of eyes following her exit, felt Cain, deep within his chest, go utterly and terribly still. Inside Elena, Sable had been listening to every word of the exchange, with a focus so sharp it felt almost separate from Elena's own overwhelming grief. The wolf had spent months watching the slow accumulation of small betrayals, warning Elena gently, patiently, through each incident that chipped away at the foundation between them. But this was different. This was not a small crack easily forgiven and forgotten. This was the entire structure collapsing at once, in front of witnesses, delivered in a single sentence, that Draven had chosen deliberately, knowing exactly what it would cost. As Elena walked through the corridors toward her room, her human mind consumed with heartbreak and humiliation, Sable made a decision that Elena herself would not fully understand or accept until days later. "We cannot stay tethered to someone who will not claim us when it matters most," the wolf said, her voice steady despite the pain radiating through their shared consciousness. "A bond built on hope alone, without action to protect it, is not strong enough to survive. I will not keep reaching toward someone who has already let go." Elena, still reeling, still packing her belongings with trembling hands, had not fully processed what Sable meant in that moment. She understood only that something inside her had shifted permanently, that the constant ache of the mate bond that had lived in her chest for 2 years felt different now, quieter, as though a door somewhere deep within her had begun, slowly and deliberately, to close. It was not a decision made in anger, though anger was certainly present. It was not a decision made carelessly, though it happened swiftly, within the span of a single devastating evening. It was, instead, the culmination of months of careful observation, of a wolf who had watched every small crack form, and had finally reached the conclusion that no amount of hope or patience would prevent the final collapse. By the time Elena reached the palace gates, bag over her shoulder, Sable's decision had already taken root, though its full consequences would not become clear to either of them, or to Draven, until much later. Behind her, in the great hall, Draven accepted congratulations from Victor Lang and his court, his expression carefully composed, his mind entirely elsewhere. He told himself he had done what was necessary. He told himself the pain in his chest was simply the discomfort of a difficult political decision, nothing more. He would not understand until much later exactly how much he had truly given away in that single, careless sentence, spoken to satisfy a rival alpha's demand for certainty, at the cost of the one bond in his entire life that had asked for nothing in return except honesty and loyalty. Sable had given both of those things without hesitation for 2 years. In the end, it was Draven who had failed to return them, and it was Draven who would spend the following months discovering exactly how permanent that failure truly was. By the 6th week after Elena's departure, the palace had settled into an uneasy new rhythm, one where the king's presence at council meetings had become a formality rather than a genuine engagement. Draven attended every session, reviewed every report, signed every necessary document, but those closest to him noticed a hollowness in his manner that had not existed before, a sense that the man occupying the throne was present in body, but increasingly absent in spirit. Rowan Blackwood, ever practical, attributed it initially to the pressures of finalizing the alliance terms with Victor Lang. The wedding date had been set for the following spring, and the accompanying negotiations over border security, trade privileges, and joint military resources required constant attention. It was reasonable, Rowan told the other council members, for a king to appear somewhat strained under the weight of such significant diplomatic responsibility. But as the weeks passed, and Draven's decline showed no sign of improving, even Rowan began to privately question whether something else entirely was at play. Draven's temper, once carefully measured even under significant pressure, had grown noticeably shorter. He snapped at servants for minor mistakes that would have gone unnoticed in previous months. He dismissed council members mid-sentence when their reports failed to hold his attention, which happened with increasing frequency as the weeks wore on. His sleep, according to the palace staff who attended to his chambers, had become fragmented and restless, evidenced by the dark circles that had begun forming beneath his eyes and the increasing number of candles found burned down to their stubs in the early morning hours. Kane's silence had not lifted since the night Elena left. Occasionally, in moments of particular stillness, Draven would catch a faint flicker of the wolf's presence, a distant echo rather than the vibrant, opinionated companion who had shared his consciousness since childhood. But full communication, the kind of easy back and forth that had guided so many of Draven's decisions over the years, had simply stopped. He found himself, more than once, standing in the training yard where he and his warriors sparred, calling out to Kane for the burst of strength and instinct the wolf usually provided during difficult matches, only to find nothing answering back. His performance suffered as a result, subtle at first, then increasingly noticeable to the warriors who trained alongside him, several of whom began exchanging worried glances whenever the king's usually sharp reflexes faltered. "You're distracted," his personal guard captain, a steady and long-serving warrior named Edmund Hale, observed one afternoon after Draven had been disarmed twice in a single sparring session, an occurrence that had not happened in years. "Is something troubling you, my king?" Draven had brushed off the question with a curt response about the pressures of the upcoming alliance, but Edmund's careful gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary, as though he suspected the truth ran deeper than political stress alone. It was not only Draven's performance that suffered. His decision-making, once decisive and confident, had grown hesitant in ways that concerned even his most loyal advisors. He postponed important rulings on trade disputes that would once have been resolved within a single council session. He second-guessed strategic decisions regarding the northern border patrols, requesting multiple reviews of plans that had already been thoroughly vetted. He seemed, increasingly, like a man searching for something he could not name, unable to focus fully on anything until he found it. One evening, nearly 2 months after Elena's departure, Draven sat alone in his private study, long after the rest of the palace had retired for the night. A single candle burned on his desk, illuminating a stack of unsigned documents he had been avoiding for days. He stared at them without truly seeing them, his mind drifting, as it did every night now, toward the memory of Elena's face in the moonlight outside the palace gates, the calm certainty in her voice, as she told him she had understood his position completely. "Kane," he said quietly into the empty room, as he had taken to doing most nights, though the wolf rarely responded anymore. "I need you to talk to me. Tell me what to do." For a long moment, silence answered him, the same silence that had greeted his attempts at communication for weeks now. Then, faintly, almost too quiet to register clearly, Kane's voice returned, weaker than Draven had ever heard it. "I am fading," the wolf said, "not dying. Fading, the way a fire fades when it has no fuel left to burn." Draven's chest tightened with a fear he had not allowed himself to fully acknowledge until that moment. "What does that mean? How do I stop it?" "You already know the answer," Kane replied. "You have known it since the night she left. You simply have not been willing to accept the cost of fixing it." "The alliance," Draven said quietly, understanding beginning to form even as he resisted it. "If I break it now, after everything Rowan and the council have built toward this agreement, it could destroy everything we've worked to secure along the northern border. Villages could suffer, people could die." "People are already suffering," Kanane answered, his voice growing fainter still. "You simply have not been paying attention to who." The wolf did not speak again that night, no matter how many times Draven called out into the silence, and by the time morning arrived, Draven found himself staring at his own reflection in the mirror, noting with genuine alarm how tired, how hollow, how fundamentally diminished he appeared compared to the confident king who had stood in the great hall 2 months earlier, so certain that political necessity outweighed every other consideration. He thought, that morning, for the first time with genuine clarity rather than vague guilt, about what it would truly mean to lose Kane entirely. A wolf and its human were not simply companions sharing a single body. They were two halves of a single whole, and a king without his wolf was not truly a king at all, not in the way that mattered most to the pack he was meant to protect and lead. He requested a private meeting with Rowan Blackwood that afternoon, intending finally to voice the doubts that had been building within him for weeks. But when the moment came, standing across from his most trusted advisor, in the same study where countless political decisions had been made over the years, Draven found himself hesitating once again, the weight of practical responsibility still pressing heavily against the growing certainty that something needed to change. "Is everything satisfactory, my king?" Rowan asked, studying Draven's troubled expression with careful attention. "You seem unsettled." "I need to ask you something," Draven said slowly. "Do you believe an alliance built on a foundation of dishonesty can truly hold when the pressure comes?" Rowan considered the question carefully before answering. "Alliances are rarely built on complete honesty, my king. They are built on mutual benefit. Whether that benefit is discovered through honest circumstances or convenient fictions matters less than whether both parties continue to find value in maintaining the arrangement." It was, Draven realized, exactly the kind of pragmatic reasoning that had guided him toward the mistake that now threatened to cost him everything that mattered most. He nodded slowly, thanked Rowan for his counsel, and dismissed him from the study, no closer to a resolution than he had been before the conversation began. That night, alone once more with his unsigned documents and his fading wolf, Draven finally allowed himself to admit, fully and without reservation, that he did not know how to fix what he had broken, and that the not knowing frightened him more than any political crisis he had faced since ascending to the throne. Somewhere far to the west, unaware of the slow unraveling occurring within the palace she had left behind, Elena Voss was beginning to build something entirely new, something that did not depend on a bond that had already begun, quietly and permanently, to close. The pack settled into the western hills, called themselves the Fenwood Territory, a small and fiercely independent group of nearly 200 members who had deliberately chosen distance from the larger political struggles consuming the northern and eastern territories. Their alpha, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara Bishop, had built the pack from a scattering of rogues and displaced families over the course of a decade, and she welcomed Elena with the same careful, practical warmth she extended to every newcomer seeking a place among them. "We don't ask about the past here," Clara told Elena during their first meeting, seated across a simple wooden table in the modest lodge that served as the pack's central gathering place. "What matters is what you bring now, and whether you're willing to work alongside people who've all had to rebuild something at some point." Elena appreciated the directness more than she could easily express. After 2 years of navigating the careful, layered politics of Draven's court, where every conversation seemed to carry hidden implications, and every relationship required constant maintenance against shifting alliances, the straightforward simplicity of Fenwood felt like breathing fresh air after months trapped indoors. She was assigned initially to help manage the pack's small trading operations, work that drew on skills she had developed during her years as a rogue before ever meeting Draven, skills that had gone largely unused during her time at the palace, where her role had been defined more by her relationship to the king than by any practical contribution she might offer. Within the first month, Elena found herself growing genuinely close to several members of the pack. Oliver Grant, a broad-shouldered warrior with an easy laugh, took it upon himself to teach her more advanced combat techniques during evening training sessions, insisting that a woman who had survived years alone as a rogue deserved better skills than the basic self-defense she had picked up out of necessity. Isabel Frost, no relation to Victor Lang's daughter of the same surname, worked alongside Elena in the trading operations and quickly became a close friend, someone Elena could speak with openly about the difficulties of rebuilding a life from scratch. It was Isabel, in fact, who first noticed the change in Elena's demeanor as the weeks passed, a gradual lightening that seemed to accompany the healing of whatever painful past Elena had left behind, though she never pressed for details Elena was not ready to share. "You smile more now than you did when you first arrived," Isabel observed one afternoon as they packed goods for an upcoming trade route. "Whatever you left behind, it seems like distance is doing you good." Elena considered the observation carefully before responding. "I think I forgot, for a while, what it felt like to make decisions just for myself. Not for a court, not for a king, Not for anyone's expectations except my own. It's strange how much lighter that feels. Within Elena, Sable felt the shift as well, a steady settling that grew more pronounced with each passing week. The wolf no longer strained against an invisible tether, no longer carried the constant low-grade tension that had defined the final months of the bond with Cain. Instead, Sable moved through their shared consciousness with an ease that felt, to Elena, almost like remembering how to breathe properly after holding her breath for far too long. "We are not incomplete," Sable told her one evening as they walked together along the ridge overlooking the Fenwood territory, watching the sun set over hills that had, in a remarkably short time, begun to feel like home. "Some wolves believe a mate bond is the only thing that makes them whole. That is not true. We were whole before Cain. We can be whole again, on our own terms." Elena absorbed the wolf's words slowly, allowing herself to consider a future that did not center around waiting, hoping, or eventually reconciling with the life she had left behind. It was a difficult adjustment, unlearning 2 years of building her identity around a bond that had ultimately proven fragile under pressure. But with each passing week in Fenwood, that adjustment grew easier, supported by the genuine community forming around her. Clara Bishop, observing Elena's growing competence and dedication over the following months, eventually approached her with an offer that surprised Elena considerably. "I need someone to help manage relations with the smaller settlements scattered through these hills," Clara said during a private meeting, nearly 4 months after Elena's arrival. "Someone with an understanding of larger political structures, but without the baggage that comes from formal ties to any of the major territories. You've handled yourself well here. I think you'd handle that responsibility well too." Elena accepted the position with a genuine sense of purpose she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. The work suited her naturally, drawing on the political awareness she had gained during her years at Draven's court, while allowing her to apply that knowledge on her own terms, free from the constant political maneuvering that had defined her previous position. Over the following weeks, Elena traveled between the smaller settlements surrounding Fenwood territory, negotiating trade agreements, mediating minor disputes, and gradually building a reputation among the local communities as someone fair, capable, and genuinely invested in their well-being, rather than in personal or political gain. It was work that filled her with a satisfaction she had never quite experienced during her time as Draven's mate, when her contributions had always existed in his shadow rather than standing independently on their own merit. Oliver Grant, who had become a close and trusted friend over the preceding months, occasionally teased her about the transformation he had witnessed since her arrival. "You walk differently now," he observed one evening as they shared a meal after a long day of training and negotiations. "When you first got here, you moved like someone bracing for an impact that never quite came. Now you move like someone who knows exactly where she's headed." Elena smiled at the observation, recognizing its truth even as she considered how to respond. "I think I finally figured out that I don't need someone else's approval to know my own worth. That took longer to learn than it probably should have." "Whoever taught you the opposite," Oliver said carefully, sensing the weight behind her words without pushing for details, clearly wasn't paying close enough attention to what he had. Elena did not respond directly to the comment, though something in her expression softened with quiet acknowledgement. She had not spoken openly about Draven to anyone in Fenwood, preferring to let that chapter of her life remain closed while she focused on building something new. But the observation settled into her thoughts nonetheless, a quiet confirmation of everything she had come to understand about the bond she had left behind. By the 6th month of her time in Fenwood, Elena had become an integral part of the pack's daily operations, respected for her competence, valued for her genuine care toward the communities she served, and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely at peace with the direction her life had taken. Sable remained steady and content within her, the calm acceptance that had followed the severance of the bond with Cain settling into something closer to genuine contentment. Neither Elena nor Sable had any indication, as the 6th month drew to a close, that hundreds of miles away, the king whose careless words had set this entire new chapter into motion had finally reached the breaking point of his own unraveling, and was beginning, at last, to search for the truth about exactly what he had lost. By the 6th month after Elena's departure, Draven's condition had grown severe enough that even the most pragmatic members of his council could no longer attribute his decline to simple political stress. He had lost weight he could not afford to lose. His hands, once perfectly steady during formal ceremonies and important signings, had developed a faint but noticeable tremor that he struggled to hide during public appearances. Most concerning of all, Hiane's presence within him had grown so faint that Draven sometimes went entire days without any sense of the wolf's consciousness at all, a hollowness that left him feeling perpetually incomplete in a way he had never experienced in his entire life. It was Edmund Hale, his loyal guard captain, who finally suggested a solution that Draven had not considered in his months of increasingly desperate searching for answers. "There is an elder who lives in the Eastern Hills," Edmund said, during a private conversation, having grown genuinely concerned watching his king's steady deterioration over the preceding months. Margaret Fenwick's sister, actually, though the two have not spoken in years over some old family disagreement. She's known throughout the region for her deep understanding of the bond between wolves and their humans, particularly the rarer complications that don't fit the usual patterns most alphas encounter. If anyone might understand what's happening to you and Kane, it would be her. Draven had exhausted every other avenue by that point, having consulted the pack's own healers, reviewed ancient texts on mate bonds within the palace archives, and even sent quiet inquiries to allied territories, asking whether anyone had encountered similar circumstances before. Nothing had provided answers that matched the specific, terrifying reality of what he was experiencing, a wolf fading not from illness or injury, but from something far more difficult to treat. He traveled to the Eastern Hills within the week, accompanied only by Edmund and a small guard detail, keeping the journey quiet to avoid raising questions among a council already concerned about the king's prolonged absence from formal duties. The elder, a woman whose age Draven could not accurately guess, but whose eyes held the particular sharpness of someone who had witnessed countless bonds form and break over many decades, listened to Draven's description of Kane's fading presence with careful, patient attention before finally speaking. "You are describing a closed bond," she said simply, once Draven had finished explaining everything he had experienced since the night Elena left. "Not weakened, not strained, closed. There is a significant difference between the two, and I suspect no one in your court has explained that difference to you clearly, likely because so few alphas ever experience it firsthand." "Explain it to me now," Draven said, his voice tight with a fear that had been building for months, finally given words and shape by someone who clearly understood what he was facing. The elder settled back in her chair, studying him for a long moment before continuing. "A mate bond, in its natural state, can weaken through distance, through neglect, through the ordinary strains that any relationship endures over time. That kind of weakening is recoverable. Effort, honesty, and genuine change can restore what has frayed, given enough time and sincerity." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "But a closed bond is different entirely. It occurs when the wronged party's wolf makes a deliberate choice, usually in response to a betrayal severe enough to convince the wolf that continuing to hold the connection open would cause more harm than releasing it. When that choice is made, the bond does not simply fade over time. It closes, deliberately and permanently, cell by cell, until reopening it becomes impossible, no matter how much the other party might wish to restore what was lost." Draven felt the blood drain from his face, understanding, with a clarity that felt like physical pain, exactly what Kane's earlier warnings had truly meant. "Permanent," he repeated slowly. "There's no way to reverse it?" "None," the elder confirmed. "The wolf who closes the bond does so with full awareness of what they are sacrificing. It is not a decision made lightly, nor one made without significant grief. But once made, it cannot be undone by any effort on the part of the one who caused the original wound." "Then Kane," Draven said, his voice barely above a whisper, "he's fading because the bond has already closed. There's nothing I can do." The elder's expression softened slightly, though her honesty remained unwavering. "Your wolf is fading because he is grieving a connection he can feel closing, but has not yet fully accepted as permanent. There is a difference between a bond that has closed completely and one that is in the final stages of closing. If you act swiftly, and if the wolf on the other side has not yet reached full and complete closure, there may still be a narrow window of possibility remaining. Hope, dangerous and desperate, flared in Draven's chest for the first time in months. How would I know if that window still exists? You would not know until you tried, the elder said simply. But I will tell you this clearly, because I suspect no one else in your life has been willing to speak such difficult truths to a king. Even if the window remains open, forcing your way back into her life through the power of your position, through grand gestures designed to overwhelm, rather than genuinely earn trust, will not succeed. A bond closed through betrayal cannot be reopened through pressure or persistence alone. It can only be reopened, if it can be reopened at all, through demonstrated change, sustained over time, offered without any expectation of immediate forgiveness. Draven absorbed her words carefully, understanding the weight of what she was describing. This would not be a simple matter of finding Elena and apologizing, of expecting his crown and his sincere regret to be enough to undo months of accumulated damage. This would require something far more difficult, a genuine transformation that he would need to prove through consistent action rather than words alone. I need to find her, he said finally, more to himself than to the elder. Regardless of what the outcome might be, I need to at least try. The elder studied him for a long moment, before nodding slowly. Then you should understand something else before you begin this search. Whatever happens with Elena, whatever the ultimate outcome of this journey, Kane's fading will not fully stop until you have taken meaningful action to address what caused this in the first place. Simply wishing for reconciliation will not restore him. You must actually become someone worthy of the trust you broke, regardless of whether that trust is ever fully returned to you. Draven thanked the elder for her honesty, though the weight of her words settled heavily on his shoulders as he and Edmund began their journey back toward the palace. He spent the return journey in near total silence, his mind consumed with the enormity of what lay ahead, the uncertainty of whether he had already run out of time, and the difficult recognition that even if he found Elena, even if some narrow window of possibility still remained, he would need to prove himself worthy of a second chance he was not entitled to expect. Upon returning to the palace, Draven immediately requested a private meeting with Rowan Blackwood, his mind made up, despite the political consequences he knew would follow. I need to speak with you about the alliance with Victor Lang, Draven said, his voice steady despite the significance of what he was about to propose. I cannot move forward with the marriage terms as they currently stand. Rowan's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession, surprise giving way to concern giving way to careful, measured caution. My king, the wedding date has already been formally announced. Breaking this agreement now could severely damage relations with Victor Lang's territory, precisely when we need his resources most, against the continued northern raids. I understand the risk, Draven said, and I will work to find alternative solutions to secure the northern border, whatever those solutions require. But I cannot enter a marriage built on a foundation that has already cost me something I am not willing to lose permanently. Rowan studied him carefully, recognizing something in Draven's expression that had been absent for months, a return of the genuine conviction and clarity that had once defined his leadership before Elena's departure had left him hollow and uncertain. This is about the rogue woman, Rowan said slowly. Elena. It is about doing what should have been done from the very beginning, Draven replied. I made a mistake that night in the Great Hall, one that has cost me more than I fully understood until recently. I intend to correct it, regardless of the political consequences that follow. Rowan did not fully agree with the decision, and made his reservations clear over the following days, as Draven began quietly making arrangements to formally withdraw from the alliance terms with Victor Lang. But even Rowan, practical and politically minded as he was, could see that the king standing before him now carried a determination that had been entirely absent during the previous 6 months of hollow, distracted leadership. Within 2 weeks, Draven had formally ended the alliance negotiations, offering Victor Lang alternative trade agreements and border security arrangements that did not require a marriage bond to secure. The Northern Territory's response was cooler than it might have been, and certainly the arrangement lost some of the strength it once promised, but it held, sufficient to maintain peace along the contested border, while Draven turned his full attention toward the search that mattered most to him now. He began that search the following morning, setting out from the palace with Edmund Hale and a small group of trusted warriors, following whatever leads they could gather, about a rogue woman who had left the palace gates on foot nearly 6 months earlier. He did not know, as he began this journey, whether he would find Elena at all, whether the narrow window the elder had described still remained open, or whether he had already run out of time entirely. He knew only that he needed to try, regardless of the outcome, because the alternative, continuing to live with the hollow, fading remnant of himself that the past 6 months had created, was no longer something he was willing to accept. The search for Elena took nearly 3 weeks, winding through trading towns and small settlements as Draven and his small group followed a trail of second-hand information gathered from innkeepers and merchants who remembered a rogue woman passing through months earlier. It was Margaret Fenwick, the tavern owner in the small trading town south of the palace, who finally provided the information that would lead Draven to the Western Hills. She found honest work and an honest place to belong, Margaret told him, her expression carrying a clear note of protective caution as she studied the king standing before her. Whatever happened between the two of you, my king, she has built something good for herself since she left here. I would think carefully before disturbing that, if disturbing it is all you intend to do. Draven had absorbed the warning with genuine humility, assuring Margaret that he understood the weight of what he was risking by seeking Elena out, and that he had no intention of disrupting whatever peace she had found, unless she herself was willing to hear what he had come to say. He arrived at the edge of the Fenwood territory on a clear afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after leaving the palace, his small group of warriors waiting at a respectful distance while he approached the modest lodge that served as the pack's central gathering place. Clara Bishop met him at the entrance, her expression guarded but not hostile, clearly having been informed of his approach by scouts stationed along the territory's borders. "I know who you are," Clara said before Draven could introduce himself. "And I know enough about why Elena arrived here to understand why your presence might not be entirely welcome. She has built a good life here, a life that doesn't depend on anyone's approval but her own. Whatever you've come to say, I'd ask you to consider carefully whether it's worth risking that." "I understand the risk," Draven said, his voice steady despite the nervousness building in his chest. "I'm not here to demand anything from her. I only ask for the chance to speak with her, if she's willing. Whatever she decides after that will be entirely her choice." Clara studied him for a long moment before finally nodding, leading him toward the edge of the territory where Elena had been overseeing a trade negotiation with representatives from a neighboring settlement. Draven waited at a distance, his heart pounding with an intensity he had not experienced since the earliest days of their courtship, watching Elena move through the negotiation with a confidence and ease that struck him deeply, a version of her he had never fully seen during her time at the palace, where court politics had always constrained the full expression of her capabilities. When the negotiation concluded and the visiting representatives departed, Clara approached Elena quietly, speaking a few words that Draven could not hear from his distance. He watched Elena's posture stiffen, watched her turn slowly toward the direction where he stood, her expression shifting through surprise, then something harder and more guarded, before settling into a careful, controlled neutrality that told him nothing of what she was truly feeling. She approached him slowly, stopping several paces away, close enough for conversation, but maintaining a clear distance that felt deliberate and significant. "I did not expect to see you here," Elena said, her voice steady in a way that struck Draven as remarkable, given the turmoil he knew must exist beneath the surface. "I know I have no right to ask this of you," Draven said, forcing himself to speak plainly, rather than retreating into the careful, diplomatic language that had become so natural to him over years of political negotiation. "But I needed to see you. I needed to tell you the truth about everything I've come to understand since that night." Elena's expression did not soften, though she did not turn away either. "Speak then. I'm listening." Draven took a steadying breath, aware that everything depended on what he said next. Aware, too, that no carefully crafted political speech would serve him here. Only complete and unguarded honesty. "I broke something that night in the Great Hall that I did not fully understand until months later. I told myself, for a long time, that I had made a difficult but necessary political decision. I told myself you would understand, eventually, that a king's responsibilities sometimes require sacrifices neither of us would choose freely." He paused, gathering the strength to continue, But that was a lie I told myself to avoid facing the truth. The truth is that I chose the easier path, the path that avoided immediate political discomfort, over the harder path of defending what actually mattered most to me. And I did not choose it only that night. I chose it in 100 smaller ways over the preceding year. Every time I let my advisors speak over your concerns. Every time I postponed giving you the standing you deserved. Every time I prioritized the court's comfort over your genuine well-being. Elena remained silent, her expression carefully composed, though Draven could see something shifting behind her eyes as he spoke. I ended the alliance with Victor Lang, he continued, not as a gesture meant to win you back, though I understand it might appear that way. I ended it because I finally understood that I cannot build my future on a foundation that required denying the truth of what you meant to me. Whether or not you ever forgive me, whether or not there is any path back to what we once shared, I could not continue forward, pretending that foundation was acceptable. And Kane? Elena asked quietly, the first indication that she had been paying close attention to more than just his words. What does he say about all of this? Draven's expression grew pained. He has gone nearly silent. Fading, an elder told me, from grief over a bond that closed the night, I let you walk away without stopping you. I do not know if there is still time to reverse what's happening to him. I do not know if there is still time to reverse anything at all. Elena's composure faltered slightly at this admission, though she quickly steadied herself again. Within her, Sable had gone very still, listening with an intensity that Elena could feel clearly, though the wolf did not immediately offer any guidance about how to respond. I forgave you a long time ago, Elena said finally, her voice carrying a complicated mixture of honesty and caution. Not because you asked for it, and not because I owed it to you. I forgave you because carrying that anger was exhausting, and I needed to release it in order to build something new for myself. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, Draven. I can forgive what happened without believing that returning to what we had would be wise, or safe, for either of us. I understand that, Draven said quickly. I am not asking you to simply forget everything and return to the palace as though nothing happened. I know that trust, once broken this severely, cannot be rebuilt through words alone, or through a single conversation, no matter how honest. Then what are you asking for? Elena said, studying him carefully. Draven considered the question for a long moment before answering. I am asking for the chance to prove, over time, through consistent action rather than empty promises, that I have genuinely changed. I am not asking you to make any decisions today. I am only asking that you not close the door entirely before I've had the opportunity to show you who I could become, if given the chance. Within Elena, Sable finally stirred, her voice quiet but present for the first time since Draven's arrival. He speaks differently now than he did before, the wolf observed carefully. There is less certainty in his words, less of the king who always believed he already knew the correct path forward. That difference matters, though it does not erase what came before it. Elena absorbed her wolf's observation carefully, weighing it against her own careful assessment of the man standing before her, a man who appeared genuinely humbled in a way she had never witnessed during their 2 years together at the palace. I need time, she said finally, her voice measured and deliberate. Not to decide whether to forgive you, because I've already told you that forgiveness happened months ago. I need time to decide whether trusting you again is something I'm willing to risk, given everything I've built here, given the life I've created that doesn't depend on anyone's approval but my own. I understand, Draven said, and Elena could hear the genuine acceptance in his voice, free of the desperate pressure she might have expected from a king accustomed to getting what he wanted through sheer force of will. I won't push for more than that. Whatever time you need, I'll wait, without expecting anything in return. Sable remained quiet within Elena as the conversation drew to a close, neither offering full trust nor complete rejection, holding instead in a careful, watchful space that mirrored exactly the uncertain territory Elena herself now occupied. The bond that had closed months earlier had not reopened, not in that single conversation, not through Draven's carefully honest words alone. But something had shifted nonetheless, a small crack of possibility appearing in what had previously felt like an entirely sealed door. As Draven turned to leave, respecting the boundary Elena had established, She called out to him one final time, her voice carrying a warning that felt important for him to understand clearly. "If you come back," she said, "come back as someone proving himself, not as a king expecting automatic forgiveness because of his position. That difference matters more than you might realize." Draven nodded, understanding fully the weight of what she was asking of him. "I will," he said simply, and then turned and walked back toward his waiting warriors, leaving Elena standing at the edge of the territory she had built for herself, uncertain what the coming months would bring, but no longer entirely closed to the possibility of finding out. In the months that followed Draven's visit to the Fenwood territory, he did not return with grand gestures or repeated attempts to persuade Elena into a swift reconciliation. Instead, he did something far more difficult and far more meaningful. He simply began the slow, patient work of becoming someone worth trusting again, without any guarantee that his efforts would ever be rewarded. He wrote to Elena occasionally, brief and honest letters that made no demands and expected no particular response, simply sharing updates about changes he was making within his court, about decisions he handled differently now than he once had, about the ongoing effort to repair relationships with his own advisors that had grown strained during the months of his decline. He did not write about longing or heartbreak, understanding instinctively that such declarations would carry little weight compared to demonstrated change over time. Within the palace, Draven's transformation became increasingly evident to those around him. He began involving a wider range of voices in council decisions, no longer allowing figures like Rowan Blackwood to dominate strategic conversations without genuine consideration of alternative perspectives. He established a formal council seat specifically designated for representatives of the Pack's smaller, less politically connected families, ensuring that voices like Elena's, once dismissed for lacking formal lineage, would never again be excluded from matters that concerned them directly. He also worked closely with Edmund Hale to strengthen the northern border defenses through means other than the alliance he had abandoned, investing heavily in training additional warriors and establishing new trade partnerships with smaller territories that did not require the kind of compromising personal sacrifice the arrangement with Victor Lang had demanded. It was slower, more difficult work than a simple marriage alliance might have provided, but it was work built on a foundation Draven no longer felt compelled to hide or apologize for. Slowly, over the following months, Kaine's presence began to return, faint at first, then gradually stronger, as though the wolf was cautiously testing whether the changes taking root in Draven's life were genuine enough to justify hope. It was not a full return to what had existed before, not immediately. But it was progress, tangible and undeniable, and Draven allowed himself to feel a cautious optimism about what that progress might eventually mean. Elena, for her part, continued building her life in the Fenwood territory, her responsibilities growing steadily, as Clara Bishop entrusted her with increasingly significant diplomatic work among the surrounding settlements. She read Draven's letters when they arrived, always with a complicated mixture of feelings that Sable helped her navigate carefully, never rushing toward a decision she was not yet ready to make. "He is changing," Sable observed after several months had passed, her tone thoughtful rather than urgent. "Not performing change for our benefit, but genuinely changing the way he moves through his responsibilities. That is different from before." "It is," Elena agreed quietly, sitting on the same ridge, overlooking Fenwood territory, where she had first begun to understand her own healing many months earlier. "But different doesn't automatically mean safe." "No," Sable agreed. "It does not. But it might mean something worth exploring carefully, on our own terms, without rushing toward a conclusion before we're ready to reach it." Nearly a year after that difficult conversation at the edge of Fenwood territory, Draven made the journey west once more, though this time he came without warriors, without the trappings of his position, arriving instead as simply a man seeking an honest conversation with someone he had wronged and hoped, cautiously, to earn back a measure of trust from. Elena met him at the same spot where their previous conversation had taken place, though the atmosphere between them felt notably different this time, softened by the months of consistent, demonstrated change that had passed between them. "You look different," she observed, studying him carefully. "Lighter, somehow." "I feel different," Draven admitted. "Kane has returned, mostly, Not entirely, but enough that I no longer feel like half a person walking through my own life. Elena absorbed this news with genuine relief, understanding intimately the weight of what a fading bond truly meant. I'm glad, she said sincerely. Regardless of what happens between us, I never wanted that suffering for you or for him. I know, Draven said. That's part of what I've come to understand about you, actually. Even after everything, your capacity for genuine compassion never wavered. I don't think I fully appreciated that about you until I had the distance to really see it clearly. They talked for hours that afternoon, walking slowly through the hills surrounding Fenwood territory, discussing everything from the changes within Draven's court to the new life Elena had built for herself. A conversation that felt, for the first time since the night in the Great Hall, genuinely balanced between two equals rather than a king and a woman whose standing depended entirely on his approval. By the end of that conversation, Elena had not agreed to return to the palace, and Draven had not asked her to. Instead, they arrived at something more honest and more sustainable than either grand reconciliation or permanent separation. An agreement to continue building trust slowly, through consistent action, rather than empty promises, allowing whatever future existed between them to develop naturally rather than being forced back into its previous shape. Sable, listening carefully throughout the exchange, finally offered her own quiet assessment as Elena watched Draven prepare to depart once more, this time with the understanding that he would return again, patiently, whenever Elena felt ready to continue their careful rebuilding. The bond may never fully reopen the way it once existed, the wolf said thoughtfully, but something new is forming instead, something built more carefully this time, on a foundation neither of us has to fear collapsing again, the moment real pressure arrives. Elena nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in her wolf's observation. That might be enough, she said quietly. Maybe it doesn't need to look exactly like what we had before. Maybe something different, something stronger, because it was built more honestly, matters more in the end. As Draven's figure grew smaller along the path leading away from Fenwood territory, Elena felt none of the devastating grief that had accompanied her own departure from the palace gates so many months earlier. Instead, she felt something steadier, something that came from having genuinely healed and rebuilt her own life before allowing anyone else back into it, on her own terms, rather than out of desperate need. She did not know exactly what the future held for her and Draven, whether their careful, patient rebuilding would eventually lead back to the deep bond they had once shared, or whether it would settle into something entirely different, a respectful partnership built on mutual growth rather than the passionate but fragile connection that had ultimately failed to withstand real pressure the first time. What she knew, with a certainty that felt solid and unshakable, was that whatever came next would be built honestly, by two people who had both done the difficult work of becoming someone worth trusting, rather than simply hoping that love alone would be enough to hold everything together the way it once had been. The sun set slowly over the western hills as Elena turned back toward the life she had built for herself, carrying with her the quiet, hard-won knowledge that healing and growth, however painful the path toward them, always mattered more in the end than the comfortable illusion of a bond that had never truly been strong enough to survive the first real test it faced. Behind her, far along the eastern road, Draven carried that same knowledge with him, walking not as a king demanding what he believed he deserved, but as a man genuinely committed to earning, patiently and honestly, whatever future still remained possible between them.